Hello and welcome to part 4 of a study series looking at Matthew 22, 33 or 34 through Matthew 40. So this is the section that's called the Great Commandment. It's paralleled also in Mark and in Luke. And you can look at part 2 that talks a little bit about those parallels. Much more could be said about them, but kind of initial examination of that parallel situation. So now I'd like to start a little bit earlier, a little bit before Matthew 22, because particularly in part 3, where I was reading different translations than those that are within the authorized version or King James Version lineage of translations, I started with the Living Bible, and the Living Bible incorporates chapter 22, verse 33 into the section on the Great Commandment, whereas most translations, most analysts of the Bible make a separation after verse 33. So the Living Bible has a legitimate reason for making that connection, and I'm going to follow that up a bit and go a bit further back, because there's a reference in this section, the Great Commandment, the question about the Great Commandment. The portion that I read in part 1 is actually an even shorter portion, because I started with the question to Jesus. But I've been kind of expanding backwards through in Matthew to look at look toward the fuller context. So let's see, where's a good place to start? There are a whole series of questions that are made to Jesus. If you're starting from the Great Commandment and you're just looking at that and hopefully not committing that most awful of offenses, proof texting, which if you know what I'm talking about, if you have ears to hear, then so on. But don't worry about it if you don't know what I'm saying. And it doesn't have to do with rising bread, I think. Now I want to give a fuller context, but not too much of a fuller context. So I'm going to start looking at Matthew chapter 22, beginning with the 23rd verse. So I'm going to go 10 verses earlier, because the Living Bible brings up, and then the others following that have this business about the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and who are they? Well, hopefully you know how to use Wikipedia and you can find out. But I'll just shut up and read. The same day, Sadducees came to him, who say that there is no resurrection, and they asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no children left his wife to his brother. So too the second and third, down to the 7th. After them all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, to which of the 7 will she be wife? For they all had her. But Jesus answered them, You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. But the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they came together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, saying, What do you think of the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, The son of David. He said to them, How is it then that David, inspired by the Spirit, calls him Lord, saying, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand, till I put thy enemies under thy feet. If David thus calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. Okay, so this is sort of the immediate context of, or at least a bit fuller context of the Great Commandment story. There's a question that's raised by the Sadducees, who are a group who do not believe in the resurrection, to which he responds, and we're not really focusing on that, but you hear what it is. And this, by the way, is the Revised Standard Version that I read from. And then the Pharisees take a whack at him. I think that's the technical term for it. And he responds to them and then stumps them. So that's it. They leave him alone. And they leave him alone in terms of asking him many more questions anyway. They leave him alone for the rest of Matthew. That's it. He's done. This is the last question that, the last sort of testing that the Pharisees do of Jesus. So it's a wrap up of a section, which is a wrap up of the whole ministry of Jesus. So where you find this in Matthew is in the eighth major section in Matthew. This one is about Jesus' final activity in Jerusalem prior to his trial and execution. And it is the section, it's a fairly well-known series of stories. The Bible is well known to many people, but at the same time, there's some parts of it that are better known than others. But the entrance into Jerusalem and the sort of final confrontations with the various groups in Jerusalem during the Passover is I'd say fairly well known. So you may already be familiar with it, in which case I don't know why you're watching this video. But in Matthew, this final ministry in Jerusalem begins in the 21st chapter, or it begins at the beginning of the 21st chapter, so it starts at 21, first verse, with the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And this is followed by the cleansing of the temple, and this strange little incident that both Matthew and Mark include. Luke does also, but he modifies it in a variety of ways. So, but the cursing of the fig tree. This is just a sort of a strange little thing that, some other time I may do a video on that. Now, I will say a bit more about fig trees, because fig tree, the imagery of the fig tree becomes a kind of a bracketing device for Matthew in this section. So the section begins, and there are numerous little storylets. They're called pericopes. I sometimes say passages, but pericope is kind of the maybe more technical word for this, for these short bits of story. So there's the triumphal entry, the cleansing of the temple, and the cursing of the fig tree. And so within 3 units of the beginning of this section, we've got a fig tree, and the fig tree is cursed and pretty much immediately withers in Matthew's version. And then very close to the end of this section of Matthew, Jesus tells a parable relating to the fig tree. So the cursing of the fig tree and the parable about the fig tree sort of create an envelope or a bracket for the rest of this section. And in this general section, the Great Commandment comes almost at the very middle of it. So you can think of it as the sort of fig tree bracketing thing around the Great Commandment in a certain way. So there's the cursing of the fig tree, there's a question about authority, how it is that Jesus has authority to do whatever he does. There's a parable a series of parables. The parable of the two sons, the parable of the wicked husbandman, and the parable of the great supper. And these occur in other portions of the synoptic gospels, but this structure of those three in sequence is unique to Matthew. Then there is the fairly famous, should we pay, who should we pay should we pay our taxes? And he says, give me a coin. And what's on the coin? Oh, it's Caesar. Okay, so give Caesar what's Caesar's, give God what's God's, paying tribute to Caesar. Again, it's in all the synoptics, but in slightly different positions, although not terribly different. They all include it in this same section, which is the final ministry in Jerusalem. That is, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke all include it. There is then this question about the resurrection, with the seven brides for one bride for seven brothers, the Great Commandment, and the question of David's son, which I read earlier in this video. And then there's the woe to the scribes and the Pharisees, which sort of closes out this section of questioning of Jesus, people trying to stump Jesus. And then it concludes with him saying, neither of these groups are really going to be successful. And certain of the other synoptics, or the other synoptics, either do not include, or so Mark does not include, Matthew does include, but places it at a different spot. The next section, which is the weeping over Jerusalem. So Matthew has Jesus weeping for Jerusalem, or lamenting Jerusalem, and then predicting the destruction of the temple. This destruction is, for Matthew, a sign of the end, along with persecutions, and the next section talks about the desolating sacrilege, that there are false Christs and false prophets who will arise, and then prediction of the coming of the Son of Man. And this section essentially concludes with the time of the coming, which is the parable of the fig tree. So this is, that's the fuller context of the Great Commandment. It begins with people, with Jesus entering Jerusalem, cleansing the temple, and then cursing the fig tree, which again, kind of strange. It's a strange little incident. And then these questions of Jesus, and he turns this around and then gives a whole series of predictions of what will be happening, and concludes with the parable of the fig tree. So when you are looking at the Great Commandment, first of all, we need to recognize that, yes, in fact, as I think it's Moffat, who, or maybe, I think it was Weymouth actually, who includes that this is from Deuteronomy and so on, right in his text. And it is important to recognize that this whole conversation that leads to the Great Commandment is about the law of Moses. It's about the Hebrew Scriptures, and they're kind of this banter back and forth between Jesus and the Pharisee, lawyer, jurist, expositor of the law, whatever it is that he is, has to do with the interpretation of the law, or the Torah. And that is being placed in a central position, and a kind of a position of a hinge between the questioning of Jesus and the predictions that Jesus makes about what is about to begin to happen. So the Great Commandment section is vitally important to this overall section, but it is a kind of a still point in the center of this kind of twisting movement. And if you read the whole section from the beginning of chapter 21 through the not quite the end of the 24th chapter, so it's about 3 chapters of Matthew that are the entrance into Jerusalem through the parable of the fig tree. You will have a much better understanding of what is the position of the Great Commandment. I guess that's sort of obvious to say that, but so this ends part 4 of the examination of the Great Commandment. And in the next, I will look a little bit at the important reflection upon the Hebrew Scriptures and the place of the Great Commandment question in the life of the Jewish community, which is clearly understood by both the expositor of the law, jurist, lawyer, person asking Jesus this question, and Jesus himself. So, something to look forward to in the next exciting episode, and I'll see you then. Maybe I'll see you for a long time if I can't get this turned off.